What if your AI written resume isn't helping you to land the job, but is actually costing you career opportunities? Recruiters are becoming increasingly frustrated with AI assisted resumes that sound perfectly polished and lack credibility and personality. So grab your cup of tea and let's talk about 5 obvious signs that you've written your resume with AI and how to fix them. AI written resumes were a really exciting development for many professionals who didn't feel so confident in their written communication skills. But in such a competitive job market, people are no longer competing on just their experience. They're competing on their tone and the personalization that they bring to their resume. And the problem with AI written resumes is that your value becomes invisible when your resume sounds like everyone else who is applying for the job. The problem with using AI to write your resume isn't necessarily that all AI writing is bad. It's that in a lot of ways, AI writing can be too good at adopting certain copywriting patterns. When those patterns are overused, it becomes increasingly obvious to recruiters that you have written your resume using AI. So if you are using AI to write your resumes, let's talk about the 5 really obvious tells that you have written your resume with AI, so that you aren't just submitting the first version of whatever it is that AI generates for you, that you can keep an eye on these things so that if you are going to be relying on tools such as Chat GPT, that you are using it in a way that is still going to help you to stand out in the marketplace and to showcase your value to recruiters. So before we dive into what those tells are, let's talk about this AI resume trap and why this is actually an issue. Because at first glance, when you might read what AI generates for you for your resume, you might think that it looks really impressive. It might have perfectly polished sentence structures, it might have perfect grammar, it might sound really impressive to you reading it. But the issue with AI written resumes is that a lot of the time, all of that can be jam packed with buzzwords. It can be trying to say a lot. It can be saying everything without actually saying anything at all. It can sound like everyone else who is also using AI to write their resumes. It can sound robotic. It can come across very clearly like it is written by AI. So, why does that even matter? As someone who reads a handful of resumes every day in the work that I do in personal branding and career branding, it is really obvious to me instantly when someone has written their resume with AI. So imagine a recruiter who is reading perhaps hundreds of resumes a day, how quickly they are able to spot an application that is written with AI versus one that isn't. And if they are able to picture that they could put anyone else's name on your application and it could read the exact same way, like your application could belong to anyone else, then you have already lost that opportunity before you've even had a chance to have an interview. And the reason why AI written resumes can be so frustrating for recruiters is that it can show a lack of interest in the job. It can show that you didn't care enough to personalize your application, which then can show, without you intending it to, that it was a lazier approach to your application, especially when compared to someone who didn't take that approach, who personalized their application, who clearly didn't write their application with AI. And importantly, it also shows a lack of clarity around what it is that you actually have to offer an organization, around your value. And this is a really important point because while an AI written resume may look really impressive, may sound really impressive, it can read like it sounds, just like what ChatGPT thought the recruiter wanted to hear, instead of what you actually No, instead of your expertise, your knowledge, your skills, your experience. It sounds too much like it is just playing to exactly what the job and the recruiter want to say, which means that you lose all of that credibility for what it is that you actually have to offer. And this is a really important point because I have noticed that when I've consulted with some of my clients and referenced things in their resume, sometimes they aren't actually sure what it is that I am referring to. So these are clearly sections of their resume that has been AI generated. So even if your AI generated resume is able to help you to get an interview, if you are able to get over the line with that and get an interview, it's not going to necessarily help you to convince a recruiter that you actually have those skills and those capabilities. So if you are using AI to write your resumes, be sure that they actually align with your expertise. My obvious sign number one that you have written your resume with AI is that you tell rather than prove. Your AI written resume, as I mentioned, is going to be packed with buzzwords, which don't necessarily show the impact that you have had in a role. It doesn't provide evidence, it doesn't provide proof points. Now, this was something that I spoke about in my recent episode on how to write resume highlights, ones that actually sell your skills and your capabilities and show the impact that you can have in a role. This takes an achievement orientated approach to your resume. So, wherever possible, make sure that you are quantifying elements of your resume. So, this might be, for example, project values. This could be budgets. This could be cost savings. It could be revenue generated. This might be figures related to growth. This could be participation figures. This might be numbers related to team sizes or turnaround time. Whether you are choosing to write your resume with AI or not, make sure that you are inputting or that you are customizing after what these key figures are, because this will add more personalization to your resume. And if you aren't able to quantify certain aspects of your resume, which may be the case because not everything can be quantified, or it may not be the most relevant way to show the impact that you have had in a role, still make sure that you are being as specific as possible. So, for example, you might name the policies, the programs, the projects that you worked on very specifically, so they don't sound like something that was generated generically through AI. My obvious sign number two that you have written your resume with AI is 3-beat writing. The art of copywriting absolutely loves patterns and rhythms. So it makes a lot of sense that this is the way that AI platforms have been trained. They've adopted these popular copywriting techniques. And these are techniques that are absolutely respected and loved by the copywriting world. But unfortunately, the way that they have been applied in AI means that they can be overused and they become really obvious to a person that is reading a document that you have used AI. We're so used to seeing these things now. And one of those patterns that copywriting loves is this idea of grouping things into threes. So you might have noticed this when you have got an AI generated copy and everything seems to be arranged in threes. And because the average person isn't a copywriter, isn't a professional writer, when writing is so perfectly polished, this is when it can become suspicious to someone that is reading it. When it reads like a platform that has been trained to write with copywriting techniques. So, for example, this is what Chat GPT generated for me to showcase this point, which, as I'm sure you'll see, reflects a lot of the writing that Chat GPT would normally do anyway. So it said, results-driven leader with extensive experience driving strategic initiatives, leading high-performing teams, and delivering operational excellence. So we've got those 3 references there. Skilled in stakeholder engagement, business transformation, and continuous improvement. Again, 3 references there. with a proven ability to build influence outcomes and achieve organizational objectives. Again, 3 references there as well. So, what used to once make writing sing and give it more rhythm is now being used absolutely everywhere. So, make sure that, especially over a larger document like your resume, that not every sentence is playing to this 3-beat rhythm. Try and include singular references wherever you can, or include 2-beat references wherever you can. Because if not, you'll probably notice that the AI platforms will automatically default to these 3-beat references throughout your entire resume. My obvious sign number 3 that you have written your resume with AI is the use of the Oxford comma. Now, the Oxford comma is actually grammatically correct, so this is an interesting one. Let's first look at what the Oxford comma is in case you're not familiar with this. So, this is a sentence with the Oxford comma. Led strategic planning, stakeholder engagement, and operational improvement. So you've got the Oxford comma before the and in that sentence. As I mentioned though, this is actually grammatically correct. The problem with using the Oxford comma is that it is more common in formal settings. So things like writing in universities or writing for government, or maybe what your corporate communications team in your work might use. But the average person, the average professional, wouldn't necessarily write this way. So that is where, when AI generated content became so popular, you started to see the Oxford comma being used absolutely everywhere. And because of, as I talked about in my previous point, and these 3-beat sentences, you are likely going to have a lot of commas just completely thrown about like confetti in your writing, because you have these sentences that require them, and then you have this perfect, really formal use of commas. So I would personally take the approach of removing the Oxford comma as much as possible, or making sure that you don't have all of these 3-beat sentences, which means that the Oxford comma is appearing absolutely everywhere as well. Now, my obvious sign number 4 that you have written your resume with AI is the contrast effect. Now, this is another beloved copywriting technique. Just like in any sort of visual design, writers love the idea of contrast because it makes the more important information pop the same way that it does in design. Now, the issue isn't that you are using popular writing techniques in your resume. The issue is that AI will likely overuse this. And also keep in mind that unless you are a professional writer or a copywriter, this isn't the way that the average person would normally write. So this is one of the really obvious ways that you can tell that this has been written in this really AI generated copywriting format. There is a lot of contrast in the writing. So let's look at another Chat GPT example where you can see this at work. So it might say, for example, I used to manage fragmented, inefficient processes across multiple business units. Now I streamline operations into clear, scalable systems that improve both speed and accuracy. So you can see the contrast there. So let's continue so you can see a few more examples of this. Where others saw reporting challenges, I built clarity through structured dashboards and simplified workflows. Again, the contrast there. Or it might say, what was once reactive and inconsistent is now proactive, data-led, and performance-driven. So you can see with all of those sentences that there is an opposite to them. They're trying to make a bold contrast. And contrast is actually, in some ways, a really good thing for your resume. It's something that is going to come out a lot in your resume highlights, for example. They are going to most likely show this before and after effect. And it's something that might also appear through other areas of your resume as well, maybe through your value proposition. But again, the problem with AI written content is that it tends to stack all of these copywriting techniques together and to overuse them. So they become really obvious and they lose all of its value, because if these techniques are being used everywhere, then it starts to sound really generic. That information isn't actually popping on the page like it is intended to. It's being lost in all of the other ways that it is applying this technique through the rest of your document. And speaking of being lost, this leads me to my sign number 5 that you have written your resume with AI, and that is that your resume has lost all personality. And this is something that I actually hear directly from clients, that they notice themselves when they speak to me. They notice that their resume seems to no longer actually sound like them. And the goal is that when you're being interviewed, your resume, no matter how professional it sounds, still aligns with the language that you would most likely be using. It aligns with the terminology that you are known for. And while it might aim to sell yourself in a way that may not necessarily come as naturally to you, it otherwise still aligns with your general vocabulary, your general tone of voice. And this is where AI can take a lot of the personality out of your resume. It also tends to shy away from first person references. And these first person references can be really impactful in your value proposition of your resume or in the blurbs for your resume. And because it doesn't necessarily have all of the information about the nuances of your role or the nuances of your achievements or how you went about achieving certain things, it tends to write in a way that is devoid of any relationships because it doesn't understand what those relationships are. It hasn't been prompted necessarily to know what those relationships were that were really critical to you achieving particular things. And so when it is pulling on these generic references or its generic training, it means that all of those relationships are taken out of your resume. And that is how it can sound really robotic. I recently reread the book on Writing Well by William Zinsser, and it really reinforced to me something that I often explain to my clients, which is that people need to visualize you being able to do certain things in your writing. The idea is to paint a picture of you operating in a role. And when you remove all of those relationships, you're taking away from that picture. So make sure that instead of just running with whatever it is that AI has generated for you, that you are personalizing those achievements. You're personalizing that experience with the relationships or your tone of voice that makes that uniquely you. That is where your resume will start to read less robotic and more like you. Because remember, when a recruiter is reading your resume, they're not just checking for perfect grammar and perfect sentences or even your relevant experience. They're trying to get a read on you as a person. Thanks so much. For more on why your resume sounds weak, then check out my earlier episode on this topic. I'll see you in the next episode.